For over a century, maps drawn in faraway Europe dictated who Africans could call neighbor, brother, or sister. Those maps built walls where there had once been roads, checkpoints where there had once been markets, and borders where there had once been families. And yet, in a move the world once thought impossible, Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana have just taken a step that shook history itself. With a single declaration, they tore down colonial borders and formed the Borderless Africa Alliance, opening their lands to one another with nothing but a national identity card. At the crossing points, tears flowed as parents walked across without bribes, as traders passed freely, as students embraced friends they once needed papers to visit. What the Berlin Conference in 1884 had chained apart, Africa is beginning to unshackle. But here is the question that lingers. Is this the dawn of Africa rising, or will the West rush in to stop it before it grows? Stay with us. This is not just politics, it is prophecy. Subscribe and walk with us into a future where Africa writes its own name across the map. The announcement did not come with fireworks or grand parades. It was issued quietly, almost humbly, from three capitals: Windhoek in Namibia, Lusaka in Zambia, and Gaborone in Botswana. Yet the echoes of those words thundered louder than any cannon across the continent. For the first time in modern African history, three sovereign nations had chosen to dismantle the colonial fences that divided them. They declared that their borders, once instruments of separation, no longer held power over their people. Instead, citizens would move with nothing but a national identity card, no visas, no endless paperwork, no bribes demanded at dusty checkpoints. At the borders, witnesses described a scene that felt almost biblical in its power. Long queues where men and women had for decades stood with documents and coins in hand, suddenly dissolved into free, flowing movement. A grandmother from Namibia crossed to see her daughter in Zambia without a single official stopping her. A cattle trader from Botswana led his herd across without counting how much cash he would lose to border agents. University students from Lusaka embraced their peers in Gaborone with tears streaming down their cheeks, no longer foreigners in their own land. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a sense that history itself was shifting beneath ordinary feet. Reporters on the ground described families carrying nothing but small bags and identity cards as they walked freely over lines that had once been guarded like prison walls. One Zambian woman told a journalist, "My grandmother died without ever seeing her sister again because of this border. Today, I crossed it in less than 5 minutes. For me, it is like a resurrection." Across Africa's media, headlines blazed. "Colonial borders fall in southern Africa," cried one Namibian newspaper. Radio hosts in Lusaka fielded calls from excited citizens praising the move as Africa returning to itself. In Gaborone, young students gathered outside government buildings, waving flags and chanting unity slogans. On social media, millions watched videos of people strolling across border posts with joy in their eyes. For the first time in generations, Africans were tasting the freedom of movement on their own continent. The symbolism could not be missed. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85 had sliced through rivers, villages, and kingdoms with rulers and ink, turning cousins into foreigners and trading partners into enemies. Now, in 21st century Africa, that map was being rewritten by Africans themselves. The posts that once marked division were being reimagined as gateways of unity. Where soldiers once checked papers, children now skipped across, holding nothing but their school books. Where trucks once idled in endless queues of bureaucracy, copper from Zambia and beef from Botswana now rolled freely, feeding markets that had been waiting for decades to be reconnected. The significance extended beyond the moment. Economists pointed out that Zambia's copper, Namibia's uranium, and Botswana's diamonds were now flowing under a common system that could redraw the economics of the region. No longer could traders be stalled, delayed, or taxed into submission at every crossing. No longer would infrastructure projects have to stop at invisible lines. A railway built in one country could now serve 3. A market in one city could now feed another across the border. And yet, as Africans danced at the border posts and sang of freedom, there was an undercurrent of tension. In Washington and European capitals, the news did not inspire celebration but unease. For if three nations could unite so boldly, what would stop others from following? Zimbabwe, Angola, South Africa, each stood nearby, watching closely. Was this the first crack in the colonial wall that might spread across the continent? For the people on the ground, the day felt like deliverance. A trader in Namibia described it best. We are not crossing borders anymore. We are crossing back into ourselves. But history is never left alone. For every wall that falls, there are hands eager to rebuild it. And so the question grows, what happens when Africa's celebration collides with foreign fear? If the announcement felt like a quiet dawn, the reaction it provoked was a storm. Within hours of Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana declaring their alliance, diplomatic cables flew across the Atlantic. In Washington, officials at the State Department gathered in late-night meetings, their language dripping with caution but their tone betraying urgency. A public statement welcomed regional cooperation but warned of risks to stability. Behind the careful phrasing lay a simple truth. The West was shaken. Planes were chartered overnight. American envoys rushed to Lusaka and Gaborone, their mission clear: slow this down. In discreet hotel conference rooms and hurried presidential offices, they urged African leaders to proceed with consultation, with oversight, with conditions. In plain words, they asked for hesitation. Yet, hesitation was exactly what ordinary Africans were no longer willing to give. The reason for this panic could be traced to the earth itself. Namibia holds some of the world's richest uranium reserves, powering nuclear plants across continents. Zambia is one of the largest sources of copper and cobalt, the lifeblood of modern electronics and electric vehicles. Botswana's diamonds, gleaming in jewelry shops from Paris to New York, are pillars of the global luxury trade. For decades, these resources had been managed separately, each nation negotiating alone, each vulnerable to pressure. But a borderless alliance threatened to change that calculus overnight. Imagine three hands clasped into one. That is what frightened Washington. Three states, acting as a bloc, could wield bargaining power strong enough to demand fairer prices, to explore deals with China, Russia, or any partner of their choosing. They could no longer be played against one another by mining giants who thrived on division. The monopoly of Western corporations was under threat not in speeches, but in concrete policy. Markets trembled. Analysts in London and New York recalculated contracts. Mining executives, long accustomed to controlling African negotiations, began asking, what happens if more join? A united front over minerals would be unprecedented. A shift not seen since the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries reshaped oil politics in the 20th century. This was not just about Africa. It was about the global balance of power. But outside the polished halls of diplomacy and corporate boardrooms, the mood could not have been more different. On African streets, in rural villages, in bustling city squares, the alliance was being celebrated as the fulfillment of a dream. Crowds in Lusaka waved flags and sang about freedom. Students in Botswana held all-night vigils, chanting slogans of unity. In Windhoek, Namibians lit candles and prayed aloud, thanking God for a day they thought they would never live to see. The emotional climax came not in policy documents, but in human voices. A Namibian elder told a radio interviewer, "They divided us in Berlin without asking us. Today, we joined again without asking them. This is our miracle." Her words spread across social media, capturing the essence of the moment. Liberation. Yet, even as tears of joy flowed, the shadow of foreign interference loomed. Reports surfaced of European diplomats warning of instability in trade. American think tanks published urgent analyses, branding the alliance as a strategic risk. The language was familiar, echoing decades of Cold War rhetoric when African independence was treated not as a right, but as a threat. Stability, in their vocabulary, did not mean peace for Africans. It meant security for foreign access. This contrast, Africans celebrating unity while outsiders framed it as danger, was the heart of the drama. It revealed what Africans had long known, that the lines on their maps were never about them. They were about others' control. And by erasing those lines, Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana had dared to challenge not only history but the structures of global power itself. The higher the joy rose in Africa, the sharper the panic grew in Washington. Each dance at a border crossing, each headline proclaiming colonial borders dead, felt like a challenge to the very order the West had built. And so the story reached its emotional peak, a continent reclaiming itself while the guardians of the old order scrambled to stop the tide. But every climax carries within it a question. If this unity is truly the birth of something new, what ripple effects will it send into the daily lives and politics of the region? And as Africa steps into its own strength, what chains remain that could yet pull it back? In the days that followed the declaration, the ripples of change began to touch ordinary lives. What diplomats debated in capitals and what markets feared in boardrooms became daily reality for farmers, traders, students, and families. The first and most immediate consequence was the easing of movement. A truck loaded with copper, leaving Zambia for Namibia's Walvis Bay port, no longer idled at checkpoints for days. Instead, it passed smoothly, with a single identification. Each hour saved meant lower costs, fewer bribes, and more competitive prices. For small traders, this shift was revolutionary. Consider the cattle herder in Botswana, who once faced endless fees and inspections just to sell beef across the Zambian border. Overnight, he could walk his herd through, confident that the profits would reach his family instead of disappearing into bureaucratic pockets. In Namibia, women who sold vegetables in local markets crossed freely into Zambia, expanding their customer base without fear of harassment by border guards. For students, the alliance meant new opportunities. Scholarships and universities across the three countries opened doors without the shadow of visa restrictions. The transformation was not only economic, it was deeply social. Families long divided by invisible colonial lines reunited in ways that moved observers to tears. A Zambian grandmother met her Botswanan grandchildren for the first time without the burden of papers. Wedding celebrations, once delayed by border bureaucracy, now welcomed relatives from all three nations. These human moments, intimate and powerful, gave flesh to the idea of continental unity. On a broader scale, the alliance began to shift political conversations. National leaders who once spoke narrowly of domestic development now addressed regional integration as a shared project. Infrastructure plans no longer stopped at the map's edge. Railway lines, energy grids, and water pipelines were discussed as arteries feeding three nations rather than one. The promise of collective strength stirred imaginations beyond Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana. In Zimbabwe, civil society groups called on their government to join. In Angola, commentators on state television debated openly whether the time had come to step beyond colonial cartography. This atmosphere carried echoes of an earlier spirit, the vision of Pan-Africanism that inspired independence leaders in the mid-20th century. Figures like Kwame Nkrumah had once dreamed of a borderless Africa, but their calls were often silenced by the realities of Cold War geopolitics. Now, decades later, ordinary Africans were reviving that dream with their footsteps across open frontiers. It was no longer only an intellectual debate, it was lived experience. Among Africa's younger generation of leaders, the alliance resonated as a call to courage. Many drew parallels with Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, who had electrified audiences with his defiance of external pressures and his insistence on African self-determination. Though he was not part of the alliance, his spirit of resistance symbolized the same determination. Africa must chart its own destiny without waiting for foreign approval. The Borderless Africa Alliance was seen as another expression of that resolve. Yet, such boldness was not without risk. Political observers warned that outside powers, uncomfortable with Africa's new confidence, might attempt to sow division. Offers of aid could be weaponized to lure one government away from the bloc. Security partnerships might come with hidden clauses designed to fracture unity. The history of Africa's post-independence politics was filled with stories of leaders undermined or overthrown once they challenged external dominance. Could this alliance withstand the same pressures? Even within the three nations, questions emerged. Would customs revenue losses create shortfalls in government budgets? Could poorer citizens truly benefit, or would advantages tilt toward larger traders and corporations? Would migration inflows spark political tensions? These debates reflected the reality that liberation, though joyous, always brought challenges. Still, for many Africans, the symbolic weight outweighed the risks. To walk freely across a border that had once been a wound was to reclaim dignity. To trade without humiliation was to taste independence. To study in a neighboring land without feeling foreign was to rediscover family. The alliance was not perfect, but it was a beginning. And so, the debate spread. Was this the spark that would light the fire of continental integration? Was it proof that Africa's destiny lay not in obeying Berlin's map but in erasing it? Or was it simply a fragile experiment, vulnerable to the same forces that had strangled unity in the past? If you believe this is the step Africa has needed all along, raise your voice, say Amen in the comments. For one thing is clear, the alliance has shifted the ground beneath African politics. The continent is no longer waiting to be told what it can or cannot do. But every liberation invites resistance, and the question now is who will try to redraw the lines once more. While the streets of Lusaka and Windhoek echoed with song, the corridors of Washington and Brussels hummed with unease. The language used by Western diplomats was polished, but its intent was plain. The United States issued a statement applauding regional dialogue while warning of risks to stability. To many Africans, the phrasing sounded strangely familiar, the same cautionary tone once used whenever a nation dared to seize its independence. In Washington, the deeper concern was not peace at the borders, it was power at the negotiating table. For decades, Africa's mineral wealth had flowed outward through carefully managed channels. Zambia's copper was signed off through contracts negotiated in isolation. Botswana's diamonds were funneled through long-standing partnerships that guaranteed profits for Western firms. Namibia's uranium-fueled reactors abroad with little bargaining leverage for its own people. A united bloc disrupted this system. 3 countries acting as one could not be leaned on so easily. American envoys, flying into Gaborone and Lusaka, cloaked their urgency in the language of friendship. They spoke of security cooperation, of development aid, of partnership. Yet, the timing betrayed their fear. Why rush overnight if the alliance were harmless? Why scramble so frantically, if not to preserve influence? The answer lay in the minerals, in the markets, and in the military map of Africa. For the United States, Africa has long been framed as a partner in need of security. Through AFRICOM and a web of training missions, Washington positioned itself as the guarantor of safety against terrorism and instability. But such logic functioned only while African states remained small and divided. A borderless bloc capable of coordinating its own security would undercut that rationale. If Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana could stand together, why should they accept foreign troops on their soil? Europe watched with similar concern. In Paris and London, policymakers worried less about security and more about commerce. Mining firms recalculated contracts, nervous about the prospect of bargaining with 3 voices instead of 1. Trade officials warned that integration might tilt African markets toward new partners. The fear was not of instability but of independence. Elsewhere, the reactions were markedly different. In Moscow and Beijing, analysts spoke openly about opportunities. China, already Africa's largest trading partner, saw a borderless bloc as fertile ground for infrastructure projects and investment. Russia, keen to expand influence, portrayed the alliance as a blow to neo-colonialism. In Addis Ababa, the African Union hailed the development as a bold step, even while some bureaucrats worried that it bypassed continental frameworks. The divergence in tone revealed the deeper truth. Where Africans saw hope, Western powers saw hazard. Where Africans called it liberation, Washington labeled it risk. And so the alliance not only redrew borders but also exposed the lines of loyalty and fear running across the globe. But perhaps the sharpest question lingers still. If 3 nations can shake the halls of power this strongly, what storm would follow if 10, 20, or 50 chose to stand as one? History, once written in ink, on foreign maps, is now being rewritten by African hands. But the question remains, what comes next? The Borderless Africa Alliance, though just 3 nations strong, has lit a torch that could either guide a continent forward or provoke storms determined to snuff it out. One path lies in expansion. Already, conversations ripple across Zimbabwe, Angola, and South Africa. If these states join Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana, Southern Africa would no longer be a patchwork of isolated economies but a unified bloc with unrivaled leverage. A common market could emerge, where goods, people, and ideas move with the ease once reserved for Europeans in the European Union. Infrastructure projects, railways, energy grids, trade corridors would no longer serve a single nation but an entire region, turning Southern Africa into a hub of integration. In this scenario, the alliance becomes not an exception, but a blueprint for the continent. Yet another path lies in resistance. Western powers, unsettled by the alliance, may attempt to slow or fracture it. Aid packages could come tied with conditions. Loans may arrive wrapped in fine print that binds governments into dependency. Political pressure, subtle or overt, may seek to isolate one member of the bloc, tempting it to abandon unity in exchange for short-term relief. History shows that Africa's boldest experiments in independence often attracted sabotage. Could this alliance withstand the same pressures? For ordinary Africans, the choice is deeply personal. Will young people embrace a future where their opportunities stretch across borders? Will leaders resist the temptation of foreign promises and instead commit to the long road of self-reliance? Will the continent, scarred by Berlin's rulers, finally find the courage to erase its lines altogether? To the elders, who lived through the days of independence and the betrayals that followed, this moment feels familiar yet different. Then, freedom came with flags but not always with food. Today, integration offers both symbolism and substance: cheaper trade, freer travel, and a renewed sense of dignity. It is the chance to see a dream, carried across generations, begin to walk. In whispers and in shouts, Africans call this moment by many names: liberation, resurrection, rebirth. Some simply call it hope. Whether that hope matures into strength or fades into another broken promise depends on choices made now. Choices of unity over division. Choices of courage over compromise. Choices of destiny over dependency. For the Borderless Africa Alliance is more than a policy. It is a test. A test of whether Africa will remain chained to Berlin's map, or whether it will redraw its future in its own image. But dreams live only if they are defended. And so the question grows sharper. What future will Africa choose, and will the world be ready when that choice is made? From the maps of Berlin to the footsteps at Walvis Bay, Africa's journey has been long and bruised. For over a century, colonial borders carved through villages, families, and kingdoms, teaching generations to see themselves as strangers. But now, with Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana tearing down those lines, something deeper than policy has taken root. It is the rediscovery of Africa by Africans. What we have witnessed is not only a diplomatic decision, but a rebirth of spirit. Families once divided are embracing. Traders once humiliated are walking with dignity. Students once blocked by visas are crossing to learn alongside their peers. The Borderless Africa Alliance is not simply about movement, it is about memory. It remembers what was lost in Berlin and declares that it will not be lost again. Yet every dawn brings its trials. Western powers are already circling, whispering of stability while meaning control, offering aid while meaning dependency. They fear not the instability of Africa, but the instability of their grip. And so, Africa stands at a crossroads between the chains of the past and the possibilities of tomorrow. But voices across the continent are rising. They echo in songs at border crossings, in chants on city streets, in prayers whispered by elders who never thought they would see this day. They say, "This is Afica rising." They say, "This is the dream of our ancestors walking again." And they ask, will we protect it? Will we expand it? Will we pass it on? Figures like Ibrahim Traore remind us that courage is the seed of freedom, but it is not a seed for one nation alone. It is a seed for an entire continent, watered by sacrifice, nourished by unity, and waiting to bloom. The choice now lies with us, not with Washington, not with Brussels, not with Berlin. Africa must decide whether to remain a warehouse for others or to become a powerhouse for itself. And that choice begins with every voice, every heart, every step taken across the lines that once divided us. If this story stirs something in your chest, do not let it fade. Share it, speak it, subscribe, because Africa's silence is over. This is Afica rising, and its voice will be heard. Tell us in the comments, New Africa, Africa rise. It's time for Africa. Let the world see that the dream is alive.